Hello, and welcome to Oxford University Linguistics Society's fifth event for Trinity Term 2021. We are here with Professor Janet Dean Fodor, who is Distinguished Professor of Linguistics at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and something of particular interest to us, an alumna of Somerville College. Um, Professor Fodor, it's an absolute honor to be here with you.
Hi, Mel. Very nice to be here with you. Thank you.
So if we start with a question, a broad question, how do we draw the competence performance distinction, and what role does that play in distinguishing psycholinguistics from theoretical linguistics?
I think that just is the same distinction, right? We now talk about linguistics and psycholinguistics. We don't often talk about competence and performance anymore, but I think it's basically the same point. What a linguistic theorist wants to know is how the sentences of the language are shaped. What I want to know as a psycholinguist is how you manage to produce them correctly and understand them correctly, given that you're in a conversation with someone. So it's really two very different sets of facts that we want to study. I'm very interested in studying the lengths of phrases inside sentences. That's of no interest, basically no interest to a theoretical linguist. But to me, it's opened up all sorts of interesting psycholinguistic facts because they're powerful length effects. You take a sentence which is easy to understand, you make the phrases shorter and it gets harder. You make the phrases longer and it gets harder. And this, well, I'm sure we'll get to this later, but this is why my research group at CUNY, have put such an emphasis on prosody, because prosodic phrasing has just this sort of quality that doesn't seem to be a fact about syntax. It's a fact about the way the pieces of a sentence are grouped, are chunked mentally. Okay.
So is it just in that sort of situation that the grammar and the parser begin to come apart? How are those things related to one another?
Yes, they can come apart. And that's because the performance mechanism has to function in real time. It has to process at several levels, like the phonology as well as the syntax and the semantics. And so there are special demands on the performance mechanism, which, as a linguist studying the competence grammar, you don't have to face up to. Right? On the other hand, if you are interested in the competence grammar, you probably want to know other things, like how does it relate to the competence grammar of another language, or all other languages, or and so forth.
So carrying on from what you just mentioned a moment ago, what a lot of your work's focused on center embedding. Um, so what are center embedded sentences, and what sorts of explanations have been historically proposed for them?
Okay. The center-embedded sentences are typically complement clauses inside complement clauses inside a main clause, right? So it's a three deep construction, and it has been notorious for decades because people say, oh, it should be a sentence of English. I did all the right things as far as the grammar is concerned, and it's completely incomprehensible. I can't even pronounce it. Right? That's the classic observation. In a recent paper, I discovered I had listed 8 attempts to explain, very different psycholinguistic attempts to explain this curious fact, right? So we are the ninth, and I think we, of course, I think that we're right, and that it has to do with the fact that the sentence has to have a prosodic structure, and the prosodic structure meets different conditions than the syntactic structure. So the syntactic structure, you can go on embedding and embedding and embedding forever, but the prosodic structure is basically a linear chunking of the sentence. Some people say it has two levels. You can go down two levels and distinguish two levels of structure. But in most ordinary uses, you're trying to make one level of structure for this sentence, which we just said is 3 clauses deep, right? And that's inevitably going to be difficult. What we have shown is that it's not impossible. It's not a grammatical problem. It's simply this mismatch between flat prosody and nested syntax. So if we make very small phrases in the middle, right? So we have a nice fat phrase at the beginning, the little boy who is the little boy on his way to school, okay? And you have a nice one at the end, long, juicy phrase at the end, fell into a puddle of mud, right? And then in the middle, you've got a clause inside a clause. But what you want to do for the prosody is balance the length or weight, however you want to put it, of that middle chunk with the first chunk and the last chunk. So prosody wants to have balanced length phrases. That's what it's concerned with, and not depth of embedding. But that's difficult, because what you've got in the middle is 2 clauses, right? And you've got to squinch them into a prosodic chunk, which is equal in weight or density to this first chunk, which is just a noun phrase, and this last chunk, which is just a verb phrase, right? And of course, it's very difficult, unusual to do that. But we can, and when we do, the participants in our experiments very often don't even notice that there's a problem with these sentences. They just sail through them. We can make up some tough ones, and we are pleased to discover that they can't sail through those, right? That's part of the test. And we have been finding, and I wish I had another 10 years of research time to follow this up, but we have been finding extreme individual differences in this. That is, some people just take to it. So you can actually hear them in the recordings. They say, oh, I see, right. And then they start again, read the whole sentence exactly naturally. And other people still don't get it. So after a dozen of these sentences embedded in a whole bunch of fuller sentences, with the most optimal lengths that we can make for them, they still pronounce it like a shopping list instead of an integrated tree structure. And I would really like to know whether, for example, we can train people to do this. Maybe they just never noticed, these sentences. If we say, pronounce it like this, they'll be off and running, perhaps. And perhaps some people won't. And perhaps that relates to other aspects of their phonological competence and so forth. So I could go on studying these for the rest of my life.
Just a quick question about the missing verb. So if it's prosodic structure, is the consistent increase in acceptability when there's a verb missing? Is that just because it's easier to get into? You get a nicer balance you don't get the middle chunk being as long.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Now, in principle, your brain ought to be able to count. I've got this many subjects, I must have this many verbs. But it's so busy, trying to group these things into nice prosodic units. Uh, it's it's a relief when one of the verbs is missing. Makes it easier to package.
So does it have less to do with memory limitations than was proposed earlier?
Uh, I don't think it's particularly a memory problem, though I suppose it's true. I mean, I must say, until you have imposed the right structure on it, then it's a memory problem, right? When it's still a list of words, if you can still see it and work on it, then maybe you could come up with the right phrasing and suddenly it's okay. But if you're trying to remember that list of 11 words there, at the same time as you're trying to make sense of it, yes, obviously that would be a problem. But generally, we let people see the sentences. And what we have been doing recently is what we call double reading task. And what we do is we present the sentence visually and we say, with a timer, we say, as soon as it pops up, read it out loud. Do the best you can, right? And almost everybody has trouble at that point, so it's natural. And then we say, okay, now sit back, think about it, do the best you can, see what you can make of it. And that's the point at which the people who really have the knack of it will produce a beautiful sentence. And other people will just do the same as they did the first time. Hasn't gotten any better at all. So that's why I'm intrigued by this. The differences between speakers are enormous. And we don't often find that in psycholinguistics. Some people are better at complex sentences than others. But it's unusual to find somebody who's essentially at zero and other people who are 100%.
So more generally, why can't psycholinguistics escape prosody?
Because it's everywhere. It really is everywhere. We spend a lot of time showing that prosody is in your head during silent reading. Okay, so I don't know why we didn't get onto this years ago. The first serious piece of research in psycholinguistics that I did was with Lynn Fraser, brilliant psycholinguist. He was my first graduate student. And we wrote this paper called, to our embarrassment, The Sausage Machine. And the sausage machine, that title has been with us ever since. And the sausage machine was this idea of chunking. It was precisely that. We said that in order to understand a complex sentence, you've got to chop it up into pieces roughly 6 or 7 words long. There had been chunking proposals before, but they had always been, they were more linguistic than ours, because they would say chunk a relative clause separately, or a complement clause, or, and we said chunk after every seven words, roughly, if that's a natural breakpoint. 6 words, 8 words, possible. But we saw it and tested it as a length effect, and not a constituent type effect. And that's what broke everything open. Now we really had a lot of data that we could bring under that heading. And that is why we should have, to answer your question, we should have realized in 1978, we should have realized that these chunks, right, these sausage links, were prosodic phrases. We didn't. We were not into silent reading, mental prosody, any of that at the time. We were just sort of trying to pick up the psycholinguistic problems people were finding and find solutions to them. But, some years later, it became perfectly clear that this silent prosody was in everything you read, think, and there it does exactly what the sausage machine was doing. That is, it was cutting by length. You needed to find a reasonable break. You don't break between a preposition and its object, right? But given that there was a reasonable break in the nearby word string, then you take it. And so now, I mean, I'm 101% convinced that everything is prosody. I would like to hear from anybody who sees this or reads on this if they don't have that sensation, right? If there are people who can read, who can talk, apparently normally, but they don't have this sort of inner voice. I don't know if it's possible. I want to know about sign language. Is there an inner signing voice? I think there is, but I need to ask the experts. But I do think it's everywhere.
So if we could turn to acquisition now, what are poverty of stimulus arguments?
Well, the very simplest is that children don't hear all of the sentences they end up being able to say. Right? It's as simple as that. That is, a learner is exposed to a sample. Somehow or other, the learner has to find a pattern of that sample and then generalize it to new cases. Okay, so that really is what the poverty of the stimulus comes down to. Did you have something more in mind about that? Some special problems?
Particularly about the sort of confusions that have been had about them in the literature at times, and specifically about negative evidence.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. Right. How do you know what's not right to say? And we've done a number of experiments. Now we do everything with spoken language. And quite often, the ungrammatical form of something that you created won't lend itself to the right prosody, right, to the right prosodic phrasing. So that's a case. I don't think that could be every case, but that's a case where you might try out a structure mentally and say, no, that couldn't be right. Because it doesn't obey the production requirements, right? But otherwise, I don't think I have any special insight into what the proper generalizations are on the positive examples you do receive. Okay, so if you look at it, if you stand back and look at it, it's a horrible problem. How do I know this is not a sentence of English or Russian or whatever? If you'd got the structure of that sentence, right, and that to change the structure would change some of the sort of general universal principles of your language, well, that would be negative evidence. But I don't believe I've solved this problem. It's not one that I've worried too much about. If I had, I'd have been very worried. But I can't help much.
So just to kind of follow on from that a little bit, what people often talk about principles and parameters in acquisition. What sorts of things contribute to the setting of parameters under some proposed theories?
Okay. So everything is phrase structure. A parameter value is a little chunk of phrase structure. So I can do this. I can plug this into a sentence, and I'm allowed to do it in my language. All right. Really completely converting linguistic theory for purposes of production into phrase structure all the way down, right? There's a one-level tree, not series of trees in a derivation. And in that tree is composed of little treelets, little pieces. And each one of those little pieces, if it's not totally universal, each one of them is a parameter value for your language. Okay? So I can do this. I can put an adverbial clause at the beginning of the sentence. Well, we can have a little treelet that does that, and that's fine. So that much we have a very clear stance on. There are no descriptive parameters that say, in this language you can do this, you can extrapose here, or whatever. You just make it work. And the reason we think that must be true is because that's presumably what children are doing, right? So children build up their sentences in little pieces. At first they can only do one little clump, and maybe later a couple of clumps go together. And slowly they're building this up, and each time they encounter a new construction and they can copy it, they can put that little treelet in too. And this, it seems to me that this all makes one coherent story, right? That sentences have this syntactic structure made of the treelets. Children are learning the treelets. Yeah. Okay.
So more recently, you've suggested that what's happening in an acquisition is some sort of grammar evaluation, or there's a grammar evaluation metric. What would that involve in? Why did people sort of move away from that way of thinking for a while?
You have to tell me, actually, who moved away and why. Has there been a movement away from evaluation metrics? What has taken their place? I mean, I know what's taken up the place for us, but you're saying in general there's a move in this direction?
I don't think I'd be able to name many names, but one suggestion we had from Hagit Borel last week was that it's some sort of superset to subset process going on, for, like in phonology, but also for syntax.
Yes, well, the subset principle is really, dead center of everything. Somehow or other, either it's a principle that you have to apply, or it's somehow built into everything else, to your whole learning process. And I think in our learning by pausing process, it is pretty much built in. I mean, you're not going to do some complicated, highly marked construction if some simple, one little treelet will do the job. So I think that, all right, with one exception I'll mention, I think that comes pretty spontaneously in our phrase structure locked approach. Now, one thing that you could catch me out on is that a simpler treelet permits more than a highly detailed treelet. So it might seem that we have something fighting the subset principle, because we would assume that the kid would pull in the simplest treelet that would solve his momentary problem. Perhaps that's not so bad, because this treelet that he's trying to find and adopt is got to fit into a tree. And the tree that it's fitted into, there's little bits that he already knows, right? He's not going to try learning this while he's also learning these other things. So he tries to fit it into a tree, and those treelets bring their own features and properties with them. And so when the child, he or she, pops this new treelet into the hole, right, it's going to pick up those surrounding features. So I haven't tried to test that out. We really ought to, do some modeling of that, and I'll put it on my list to do.
So more specifically, what's the evaluation metric model you're proposing? What would that look like? You've mentioned not here, but you've written about a sort of lattice model.
Yeah, the lattice model was part of a computational model of setting parameters. My colleague William Sakis is the brain behind all of the computational work, and we had devised 13 parameters, basic parameters, created a huge database, and set to work several kinds of learning models on that. And the lattice worked out well for that, because what it did was erase sort of from the bottom up anything that wasn't working. So if this parameter value was getting in the way of something, it's gone. And slowly, from an enormous lattice, when you take 13 binary parameters, right? I mean, it's thousands, and they're all ordered by subset to superset, all the way up. So if God or whoever were kind enough to give you that lattice in your brain, it would be very useful for a subset principle, right? You just knock off the ones at the bottom when they're not rich enough, and as you crawl up the lattice to richer and richer supersets of that, you're not in danger of making a massive superset error of overgeneralizing. Whether that's how brains work, I don't know. I mean, it was a beautiful computational study. And maybe it's something like that is how your brain works, but I wouldn't put my money on that.
I think that's all our questions. If you have anything to add.
One of the notes that you sent me, it implied, I think, that our language modeling was not sensitive to the current work in linguistics, right?
Okay.
So, and I think that's true. It really is. It is true. I have a lot of trouble myself. This is an autobiographical fact. I have a lot of trouble dealing with the minimalist program, just because. I mean, it's being presented as linguistics. I'm trying to read it as psycholinguistics, because that's me. But it just doesn't seem to make any sort of sense as part of a mental mechanism to me. And so I Well, I have to admit that I haven't followed it well enough. I find it difficult to follow. I discovered recently by looking in the literature that other people find it difficult to follow, so it's not just me. And maybe you know better than I do as a linguist rather than a psycholinguist. Maybe you can tell me what it is that makes not just psycholinguists, but theoretical linguists, some theoretical linguists, makes them nervous of the way that the minimalist program is going.
It's interesting you mentioned that. When we had David Purple on, one of the concerns he had was that theoretical linguistics sort of proceeds without enough consideration of real-time processing. And maybe that's part of the reason it looks the way it does. And I'm sure you know this, but Oxford happens to be a lexical functional grammar department. So at least at the undergraduate level, the syntax taught here is just, it's completely, there's no government and binding or minimalist program stuff.
Oh, okay.
And I think part of the, there are some considerations brought up, like extraction without traces, as motivation for that. Which I think was a paper you and Sag worked on. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what was I going to say? I've lost my foot. No, I can't do it. Phrase structure grammars seem to me the most natural for processing with, but then I don't know enough about lexical-based grammars.
So, do you think it might be that minimalists are willing to draw the competence performance distinction much sharper than in other frameworks?
No, I think that they're not paying attention to the performance side of things. It's pretty clear, right? That's okay. Yeah. That's their job, right? They're the competence guys, and that's their job. But I did come across something recently. I'm trying to think who it was. Norbert Hornstein, who is supportive of minimalism, and put a new spin on it that actually worked for me, got through to me. And that is what he are trying to find out is the evolution of the language faculty, right? So then maybe you just cut back to some very sort of raw beginning. And if that's what's going on, then that may be exactly the right way to approach it. If you're trying to explain how everyday people talk in everyday languages, I don't think it's going to work.
One of the things he mentioned to me that got through a bit to me was that the idea is not that government and binding is completely wrong. The idea is to sort of come back to those insights just in a more roundabout and sort of principled way according to minimalist strictures. So at the end of the day, we're still hoping to end up with a government and binding style grammar, which I think makes it a little bit more palatable for me as well. That so those sorts of things, the familiar things from back then, are still could still be true, especially with production considerations. While we're just sort of, if if we're up to minimalist syntax, we're trying to rediscover them in a way.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Perhaps. It seems to me that there must have been a, a psychological basis to language even when it was first beginning to develop. Right? That it is not as abstract as the minimalist program claims. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that they really want to strip away all the features, but I want to do the opposite. I want my little treelets to be peppered with features, because that tells that treelet, who to make friends with and so forth. I mean, mine I see as a jigsaw puzzle system. I've got these little pieces, they've got to fit together. When you slot in a new one, you've actually loaded something, and so on. So if we just say we're trying to meet different goals, then that's okay.
Thank you for joining us on this. It's been tremendously interesting. I'll stop the recording.
Well, could I just say, I want to tell you, it is just personal history in Oxford, that I had these amazing tutors, Elizabeth Anscombe and Stuart Sutherland, and Philippa Foot and Iris Murdoch. I mean, just staggering. Michael Argyle. And I went up to Oxford with no knowledge of anything. I mean, just from my little suburban high school. And so Oxford gave me all of that. And what happened towards the end of my time there, with these distinguished people, was George Miller came visiting from the States. And he took me under his wing, and he said, "I'm sending you off to Chomsky." And that's where I am, right? That's how it all happened. So it all came from Oxford. And I want to say thank you to the university.
That it's particularly of interest to me because the other half of my degree is philosophy too, and I'm at St. Hugh's, which I think is where Elizabeth Anscombe was.
No, she was at Somerville.
Oh, I think she was an undergraduate here. I'm not completely
Oh,
sure.
as an
Yeah,
undergraduate? Elizabeth Anscombe as an undergraduate?
yeah.
I would like to have seen that.
Yeah, my philosophy tutor, Adrian Moore, also, I think he knew her briefly when he was at Cambridge with Bernard Williams as well. And yeah, I hear she was sort of had quite a strong personality.
Yes, very, very eccentric in many ways. When I had tutorials with her, I went to her house, upstairs to her study, and there would invariably be 2 or 3 little kids playing on the floor and doing terribly dangerous things like spinning an open umbrella or playing with one of those little packets of sewing needles, or I mean, she had a lot of children, and they were part of my tutorials as well. So some of the time I couldn't concentrate on what she was saying because I was looking at this little child about to swallow a pin.
Could I ask if you knew Peter Geach then?
No, Peter was, where was he? Up north. He wasn't at Oxford. I'm sorry, I can't, Leeds or somewhere like that. And he apparently, appeared sometimes, but we didn't get to mingle with Peter Geach. I think they were both tied up in their minds. They didn't really recognize other people. I don't know. I shouldn't say that because I didn't know them well, but it was quite an experience. And then Iris Murdoch breezed in back from Paris wearing her tall black leather boots and very cool, very charming. Well, charming, I mean powerful in her own fashionable way. And these two women with these, total opposites, and I just felt so lucky to have both of them. I didn't learn much philosophy. I'm not a good philosopher. My husband's a philosopher. I never did philosophy very well. But as soon as somebody showed me linguistics, I was off and running.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about it. So thank you again.
Good. I hope to see you one day in Oxford. Okay. Bye-bye.